Hello and welcome to our leading interview series. I'm Carol Schwartz, the founding chair of the Women's Leadership Institute Australia, and today I'm speaking with Jackie Fairley, the CEO of ASX-listed company Starpharma. Bit of background of Jackie, who's got the most fabulous experience. She has 30 years of management experience in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries, working in business development and senior management CEO roles with several ASX-listed companies, including Starpharma, CSL, and Folding, which is now part of Pfizer. Now, Jackie was appointed the CEO of Starpharma Holdings in 2006, and under her leadership, the company has developed and achieved Australian and international regulatory approvals for 2 novel healthcare products and signed global licenses in 160 countries. So an absolute Australian success. Jackie holds first-class honours degrees in science and veterinary science from Melbourne University. She also has an MBA from the Melbourne Business School, where she was the recipient of the prestigious Clemenger Medal. Jackie is also a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and in 2016 was elected a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. So welcome, Jackie.
Thank you very much, Carol.
Now, these are very interesting and unsettling times for all of us. And as someone who works with our science and medical industries, how is COVID-19 affecting your professional life?
In the early days of COVID, I guess it was an anxiety-provoking time for staff. And so there was, I think, a lot of time involved for our management team in terms of obviously developing the business continuity plans, making sure that we had procedures for staff, that we instituted all of the safety and hygiene facilities and things that one needed to do to continue working. And so I think in the early days in particular, it was a constant, there was a constant cycle of information that was coming out from the authorities and recommendations, and then the needing to institute those in your business almost real time, which was a very intense period. I know that, many management teams face that. But for us in particular, being in the pharmaceutical industry, the emergence of this new disease also brought with it the, thinking about whether there was a role that we could play in potentially developing something that may assist with the control of the condition. And so we happen to have some antiviral compounds, one of which is part of approved and marketed products around the world. And so we very quickly pivoted to look at whether that was active in the COVID, in the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is what causes COVID-19, and we're delighted to find that it is in fact active. So that has created, quite a change for us as a management team, in that we've got an additional very urgent program that we're now managing on top of integrating all of those activities into the business that come with just functioning a business in COVID-19. So it has been a pretty intense period, but I think, very rewarding to be able to think that, our scientists and our organisation potentially has the ability to contribute to and, develop a product that could assist with particularly the prevention of it, which of course is such a big issue for us, given that a vaccine is probably some time away.
Yeah. That's very interesting. So what is the difference between vaccination and prevention?
So vaccination, it is a preventative. It's a preventative measure, but it's you rely upon giving someone a dose of something which will result in an immune response, and then their immune response will protect them against the virus. That's, I guess, that's the aim of a vaccine, and you hope to have something that would be 70 or 80 or 90% effective. But if certain kinds of infections, it's very difficult to generate a meaningful immune response, and therefore it's very difficult to develop an effective vaccine. And it seems that coronavirus is one of those viruses which is pretty tough to develop a vaccine for, maybe tough to develop a vaccine for. And so I guess the other preventative strategies, apart from obviously the personal protective gear of masks and goggles and visors and things.
And new fashion trend.
Yes, a new fashion trend. That's right. I haven't actually mastered the art of making them myself, I have to admit, but I see there are some ways that you can make them even without sewing. But the other preventative strategies include things like, and in fact the one that we're pursuing is we have an antiviral compound, and therefore it's possible to formulate it into a nasal spray or an inhaler that you could actually spray, administer a nasal spray in your nose and mouth, and then you would essentially have the antiviral drug, if you like, sitting there waiting to sequester or capture the viral particles and stop them from infecting you. So it's an alternative prevention strategy, and it's in addition, obviously, to your mask or whatever other things you're using. But I guess it's an alternative preventative strategy that you could use whilst we wait for a vaccine, in addition to a vaccine, or if we can't get an effective vaccine.
Right, so it's sort of almost like a coating of the antiviral onto the membranes that actually can absorb the virus as virus penetrates it.
Yeah, that's right. The concept is to have this antiviral already in your nasal passages, potentially in your sort of pharynx, so in at the back of your throat, so that it's sitting there waiting to neutralise or inactivate the virus that actually you inhale or you ingest. We're also looking at the application of the product as a treatment as well, but in the first instance, for a number of different reasons, the preventative strategy is probably one that we'd be able to advance more quickly, get approved more quickly, and so make available to people more quickly. So there's an incredible degree of prioritisation going on to try and focus enough, to try and compress what would normally take months and years into sort of days and weeks, which is a new experience for us all, but a very rewarding one.
Very rewarding, because of course that would mean innovation and new ways of doing things. I mean, they say necessity is the mother of invention, so that's really what's happening.
I've seen that in our own organisation. Obviously, apart from that particular application of one of our products, we've had we employ about 25 chemists, and they work in laboratories synthesising new pharmaceutical compounds. But in the early days of the lockdown in Victoria, as you well know, it was virtually impossible to buy hand sanitizer and things like that. So our chemists were actually making hand sanitizer in the lab. People were, scrounging around to get aloe vera here and alcohol there. They were formulating in the lab. We had 2 or 3 different recipes that people were making, and then the staff were expressing their views as to which they thought was better, which smelt better, which had a better sort of sense, sort of feel. But it was there was a real sort of feeling of shared sort of, community, and sort of, people were very keen to be able to contribute. We were providing hand sanitizer to businesses, who were down the road from us, who were unable to get it for themselves. So I think it's out of that sort of sense of, the pandemic and the, impending threat, I think comes a great sort of collegiate feeling. And I think it does lead to a lot of innovation. And I think that's essentially the basis of our business. But I've certainly seen more of it in the recent past as a result of the, what we're all facing.
That's great. And has that been maintained throughout the last few weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we have around half our staff can't work from home because they're laboratory based, and so our laboratories are continuing to operate full steam ahead. Our manufacturing facility is operating as usual, and then the office-based people have been doing a sort of rotational working from home arrangement to try and depopulate the workplace, I suppose, to make sure that We've got people, spread out as much as possible. But it has been, not only within the organisation and within the, our neighbouring companies, but in the industry, Australian pharmaceutical companies have been asked by government, and we've been asked by government, can you make these reagents for the COVID-19 diagnostic test kit? Because if we can't secure supply of them internationally because there's too much competition, or because we're unable to get the product here because of freight restrictions. And in fact, so we have responded to government tenders to provide things that we would never normally make, but because we have chemistry facilities and because they're at the GMP, good manufacturing sort of standards, we're probably one of a handful of Australian companies that would be able to make it locally. So it's created all sorts of opportunities and different working sort of opportunities. And it has, it's been a really energising environment. I think, staff are enthusiastic and excited about being involved in a national effort of that kind, but also excited about being involved with, potentially a product that could assist. So I think we're certainly lucky in that regard, but it certainly is a different environment from what we usually operate in.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Do you think that your organisation is actually going to adapt some of those changes going forward?
I think we will. We have always been, because pharmaceutical development is such an international business, and because Australia is a long way away and we have relatively few pharmaceutical companies in Australia, we have always had a business which is very much focused on the international. The Australian pharmaceutical market is about 1% of the world pharmaceutical market. So you would never sustain a business on the basis of selling just to the Australian pharmaceutical market. So all of our programs are global. And so that means that we do a lot of conference calls and video calls and things ordinarily. But we also, I would typically travel to the US, 5, 6, 7 times a year. And I think that because this has forced us all to remain, in our home country, you are just, accepting the fact that a face-to-face meeting is not possible. And there are some disadvantages of that, clearly, but we have no alternative. So you really just need to, I think we've all become, you're probably the same experts on, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Skype, all of the various different platforms, because everyone uses a different one, it seems, the WebEx, Cisco WebEx, and to make sure that we develop protocols for calls so people introduce themselves and explain what they do and their voice is identifiable. And I think using video more is certainly something. Ordinarily we might do a lot of things just on the telephone, but where you don't have an opportunity to meet someone face to face, clearly the video interaction is far more, is a far more comprehensive one. And so we do probably more video things than we used to. But I think it will change things. It will change some of our travel activities. But I think it's, I think everyone is also accepting of the shortcomings that we all suffer from needing to use these less than ideal platforms. Yeah. I must say that I hate to think what it would have been like to try and have this whole working from home and lack of travel. If you think about even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it would have completely ground everything to a halt. Whereas, the impact on our business of having half of our, desk-based staff working from home is really very minimal. Whereas 10 years ago, it would have been a whole lot harder and a whole lot more frustrating.
So, it's something that I think about in my businesses as well, whether all of a sudden I'm seeing the opportunity for people to work more flexibly in a more, in a much more, meaningful way, can now take place because of these technologies that are available. And the connectivity that's there is fantastic.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that, you often think, oh, well, no, that job couldn't be done remotely, or you couldn't do that without a face-to-face meeting. Well, you know what? When you're forced to, then you do. And, it's a different way of doing it. But I think it will dispel many myths about what can and can't be done remotely. Although I have to say that one thing I would say is when you need a whiteboard and you're trying to point to the whiteboard and you want everyone to see what you're pointing to, that sort of sharing of the screen is a slightly clunky way. I mean, it's very good, but it's nothing the same as if you're trying to do something where you need to be able to point. It still helps to be in the room together, and certainly, we still find the need to do some of those things.
Jackie, I'm interested in your international travel. So tell me, when would you feel comfortable getting on a plane again and travelling to the US?
Well, the US at the moment is, so I guess a lot will be influenced by the availability of an effective vaccine. And so I think one hopes that, and I know that there are trials already ongoing, and certainly I would absolutely hope that we can develop it quicker than any other vaccine we've ever done before, because typically vaccine development is slow. The nature of the clinical trials that you've got to do to prove if they're effective means that they take longer and they need more people. So if there's an effective vaccine, then, 3, 4, 5 months from now, you could sort of hope to be there. We won't have a vaccine at that stage, I think. And so I think probably, I think travel for the remainder of this calendar year, in the absence of a sharp decline in the cases. I mean, there's no way at the moment you would go to the US right now. I mean, no, there are parts of the US that probably have very low sort of caseloads, but I think that there are all sorts of things that one's going to need to think about. I mean, in addition to vaccine or not, travel insurance, health insurance, how that's applicable, if you were to become ill, and then being sort of stuck there. So I haven't really sort of got a firm answer to that, but I think it's unlikely to be before the very end of this year. And that would require, I think, the disease to really fizzle out. And it doesn't look like it's going to do that.
In fact, it hasn't even really taken off, has it, in a lot of places in the world yet, like Latin America, South America, Africa, and what'll that mean for, going through airports and who's going to feel safe going through an airport?
The threshold will be much higher for international travel, and I think that there'll be all sorts of precautions that people are taking, but I think that it is a way off yet. I really think that we certainly hope that it would be fabulous if, one of the vaccines we already have proves to be effective and have some, provide some resistance. That would be a great outcome, or one of these new ones can be developed very quickly. But I really feel that that's probably not going to be until 2021 at the earliest. And so I think we're going to be facing very restrictive travel until that time. I mean, there are some locations where you probably wouldn't be too worried, like New Zealand, but I think many other locations and all of the locations you would go to for business typically, the US and Europe, I think there's a lot of water to go under the bridge before one would be hopping on a plane to go there.
Yeah, well, I must say that I've been very impressed with the formation of a national cabinet.
Yeah.
I think, when you contrast the way Australian political leaders have managed as opposed to the Americans, for example, I think that we have done incredibly well. And, and hats off to the politicians who've been able to put politics to the side and work for the good of, our nation. I mean, that's what you want out of politicians, who in a time of crisis can actually work for the whole of our society, which I think they've done quite well.
I agree with you. I think they have done a great job. I don't know about the closing of the borders. I'm not sure that that was particularly effective. And yes, it took me by surprise. But I think that generally, and I think the National Cabinet was an excellent idea. And I think for businesses, and I'm sure you felt the same thing, you know, it was hard enough to keep up with what was happening as the situation emerged in Australia. If you had 5 different or 7 different sort of views of it that you were trying to there's no way that you could actually run a business. So having a clear, consistent approach really is what you want. And I think that, you know, I think that we had that in large part, not in every single item, but in large part we did. And I think that, you know, the figures speak for themselves. I mean, I think it's a remarkable, you know, given what we thought we were facing, you know, 6 weeks ago, you know, we're in an incredibly, you know, people from all around the world are looking at Australia, I think, as, you know, one of the most effective control sort of procedures that it's been put into place. So I think, you know, the politicians have worked well together, and the community has also risen to the challenge and, you know, adhered to the recommendations in large part. And, you know, I also am very pleased that we didn't institute the kind of lockdown that they did in New Zealand, where everyone was literally locked away, and that in businesses where people couldn't work from home, they were able to attend the workplace. Because I know in our situation, half of our staff are laboratory based and they couldn't work from home except for a relatively short period of time. And so we've been able to keep all of that business going by spreading people out and having all of the normal hand washing procedures and things. And so our, you know, in terms of the impact on our business, that's been mitigated very significantly by having that flexibility. And I think, you know, Victorian cases speak for themselves. There's very little community transmission. We've had no cases in the company, and you know, and so we've been adhering to the recommendations, but the business has been able to continue on, and you know, I think that's a great thing.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I've been in communication with colleagues in Italy and in the UK, and particularly in Italy. I mean, there has been really severe lockdown. I mean, there's no traffic on the streets. There are no pedestrians. There's no business running. And here in Australia, we've sort of been able to create almost like a hybrid lockdown, because you've still got businesses like Bunnings that are open, Officeworks, Harvey Norman, you know, supermarkets. And our colleagues in Italy tell me that, you know, they have to line up at a supermarket. It takes them 4 hours to get in. Then they're restricted in what they can buy. The shelves aren't full. And then go back. And then if they're seen to be dawdling, there are policemen all over the streets asking them what they're doing in the street and telling them to get home. Whereas here, you know, it's almost like things are not all that abnormal. You know, like you can drive down the roads, like we've been staying, as I said, out of Melbourne. And when we go to visit my elderly parents, there are cars, you know, on the freeways and in the streets. There are people walking in the streets. I mean, obviously not as normal, but it seems to be that hybrid, and it seems, as you say, to have worked really well.
You know, the impact on the economy is, you know, has been so profound anyway, that the fact that we've been able to retain and keep businesses open, you know, those businesses that can operate remaining open, I think has been a real advantage. I must say that one of the experiences that we had in going into the lockdown period is there's a lot of staff anxiety, obviously, as people are seeing on the internet and watching on the television every night, it might be this bad and we might have this many people, and they're looking at Italy and all the other things. And it did actually, I think, require quite a strength of will not to shut the business. because around us, I mean, people would come into my office and say, oh, Deloitte have sent everyone to work from home. And PwC, daily you'd be hearing about all of these businesses having everyone work from home. But in those businesses, of course, they can largely work from home. It doesn't really alter. They can all work from home because they're really desk-based. But when you've got a business that doesn't have that, you've got a facility, a manufacturing facility or laboratory-based things, it's a big call. And so I'm very pleased that we actually were not essentially sort of put into that, or forced to do that by the government, because I think that would have a devastating effect on the economy. And I think what we've seen is we didn't need to do it. So, it's great that we didn't have to.
Yeah, it is great. I mean, of course, because so many businesses have had to shut down, like restaurants, cafes, clothing shops, non-essential retail. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what the world looks like when we all do emerge.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I've noticed, and this is, not in the professional sense, is we've taken a view of our area where we live, that there are restaurants that we would ordinarily go to, and now we go there and get takeaway once a week to make sure that, to make sure that they're supported by their community, and that that they come out the other side. And I think there are lots of people who are doing exactly the same thing. Ordinarily, we would never buy takeaway, but if it's to keep our favourite restaurants, going, and so that they have some income, then I think people band together in all sorts of ways.
I agree. Jackie, I'm going to move away a little bit from the current situation that we find ourselves in and talk a little bit about women in the media, because you've been on our Women for Media database for I think since we started, and you're a member of Chief Executive Women, and really you're very much a leader in an industry that's traditionally been led by men and is very male dominated. So I'd like to ask you, what are some of your personal observations on the way that gender and gender equality affects leadership?
So I guess my view on gender and leadership is that leadership capability is sort of, gender's irrelevant at a sort of, at one level. I think that there are fabulous leaders, male and female, and certainly I've been lucky enough in my career to, have many bosses who are both males and females who've been very good leaders. I think there's a sort of sometimes a slightly different style, and I think a greater sensitivity to certain aspects, perhaps, which is more prevalent in a female leader than in a male leader. I think the EQ tends to be, there tends to be perhaps a little bit more insight into some of those, sort of personality issues or things that influence people. And I think that can be extremely helpful and useful, I think, particularly in a role where, one's involved in negotiation and those things, that can be very helpful. So I don't think at a high level there's really a great deal of difference. I think that, in my industry, well, and if I look at listed companies, one of the things that disappoints me greatly, but also I still can't quite get to the bottom of, and I haven't really got my sort of theory well formed on it, is why it is we've been so unable to shift the percentage of female CEOs of listed companies. We've been quite effective in shifting the percentages of board members. That shifted in the last 10 years. It's still low, but it has shifted from a very low level to just a low level, into the 20s or 28% or wherever we are now. But female CEOs, in the time I've been the CEO of Starpharma since 2006, so a fairly long-serving sort of CEO. Over that time, the percentage of female CEOs in the ASX 300, which is the index that we're in, hasn't changed at all. It goes up and down. It can be swings. There are so few people. I think it's, sort of between 2 and 3%. It's been between 2 and 3% for all of that time.
Yeah.
And that really is sort of curious to me. And I feel that I don't know that that is about quotas. I don't think that's addressable by things like quotas, because when people are making those decisions of appointing CEOs, I think it's more about making sure that the next level down, you have enough people to choose from to actually take them into that next level role. And that, I think, there's been progress made on that, but I still think we've got a long way to go. But I also think that there are, some organisations where that's just not, there's obviously, unconscious bias or conscious bias, which really, really impacts that. And I think in our organisation, I've been the CEO for 14 years or so, and on the board we've had 40% women for the last 12 years, and that is sort of a standout. I think that there's something about the culture of an organisation and the way people's attitudes and things, and that's what I think really has to be addressed. And it's sort of it's finding ways of tackling those cultural biases. The cultural biases, I guess, to try and get some of that next level management in place.
And do you think that the media has a role to play in this? Because how do you find the difference between the way the media sort of portrays male leaders as opposed to female leaders?
I think that's a really interesting question, Carol. And I think I personally have not experienced this in the media, although I do want to talk about when I say the media, I mean the print media and televisions and things. Maybe social media I'll come back to in a minute, but because I think that's different. But I think in the mainstream media, I think there is a really different attitude taken to female leaders compared to male leaders. And I think there was an excellent piece of research that I think you may well have actually put on Twitter, or I'm pretty sure that you're aware of it. It was done by Harvard. It was a 10-year analysis of media coverage of corporate crises. And apparently in those, and I can't remember what the number of situations were, but it was a 10-year period, and they found that I think in 80% of cases where it was a female CEO, the crisis was attributed to her, whereas I think it was about 20% the crisis was attributed to the male CEOs. And it was a case study of many, many situations. So clearly that does suggest, and I think that is what we've seen in the media in the last few years. And I think about the situation with AMP, the incredibly personal nature of the attacks that were made for the chairman of AMP. I don't know her, but I think it's Carolyn Brenner or Catherine Brenner. I thought were just outrageous. And I just felt that, people were attacking her on the basis of something her husband had done and chasing her as she was dropping kids off to school and things like that. And I think that we've seen that in the media before. We've seen that with politicians. We saw it with Hillary Clinton. We've seen it with Julia Gillard. And I think the media, I don't know, I wouldn't have thought the media as a group would see themselves as sexist. But it seems that the way that people are portrayed in a situation like that, a corporate crisis, it does seem like it's different to me. And I don't really know quite how that's sort of done, but it does. That's my my interpretation of it. It does seem quite different.
And social media?
Well, social media, I think, is it has an incredible benefit on many levels in terms of dissemination of information and allowing people to have a voice. But social media and things like chat rooms, where people actually don't have to disclose who they are and say these things without, it's almost, I think people should have to stand there and say something to your face. I don't think they should be able to sit in their lounge room and write these horrible, venomous comments and then never really, sort of own up to it. I think I read something recently about Lee Sales, who did an interview recently I can't remember who it was with. It was with the Prime Minister.
It was with Malcolm Turnbull.
Malcolm Turnbull, that's right. And it was the most, venomous commentary on her. Some people saying she'd done a great job and other people said she hadn't, but just the tone and the language was the kind of tone and language I'm pretty sure her male colleagues never, ever would have had to put up with. And I think that's a very sad indictment of society. And I see that also in investor communications on occasions and in the media where they deal with female CEOs. I remember a female senior manager who, there was a corporate issue going on that was clearly it was not her fault, but it was clearly very negative for the business. And she was described as having a bad hair day, and I thought, no, at no stage would you ever have anyone make any comment about a male's hair, probably apart from Donald Trump, perhaps. But I mean, it's very unfortunate, and and I feel it's a sad indictment of society. And for the investors who sort of make comments behind closed doors and never actually have to say things to someone's face, I think it's very unfortunate, because I think it does bring out the worst in people's behaviour sometimes.
Yeah. Jackie, you've been incredibly generous with your time today. Thank you. But I'd like to finish with one last question. What are you reading at the moment, and what would you recommend to read?
Well, I have to say that generally when I read, I only really read usually when I travel or when I'm on holiday. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, I can't really find time most of the time to read. But and in fact, I usually have about 3 or 4 books running at any one time. So I'm not the kind of person who picks up one and then focuses exclusively on that. I'll have, they fall into 2 categories, I think. They fall into the category of, people who I find really interesting and I want to learn more about. Mm. So, I like biographies. Michelle Obama's biography I found very interesting. Hillary Clinton's biography I found very interesting. Gail Kelly's biography I really enjoyed. So you can see there's a theme there. I often will read biographies of successful women in all sorts of different spheres, but not exclusively. And then I have another category which is more in the escapism category, because I feel that particularly after watching all of the news, and if you're hearing about the global pandemic and things like that, I find that I really need something to sort of make me laugh. So I always love anything that Judith Lucy writes. I think she's hilarious. Kitty Flanagan has got a great book out, which has got her rules for life, I think. And so I often have, I go for something with a bit of comedy in it. Or the other part of escapism, which I quite like, are whodunits. But I particularly like them when they've got female protagonists. So I've got a series of them where they've got female private investigators or Janet Ivanovic, who combines both humour and whodunits. And I put those more in the escapism category, or sometimes the odd travel book.
Right. Great. Thanks. Sounds like you have a very eclectic taste in reading, which is fabulous.
I do.
Jackie, thank you so much for your generous time today, and congratulations on the work Starpharma is doing. And please keep us in touch with that, because I think it's fantastic. And wishing you all the very best, and stay healthy.
Thank you very much, Carol. Thank you.